My name is Sarah Jenkins, and for 18 years, I've been a nurse in the emergency department at City Central Hospital in Philadelphia. After almost 2 decades on the graveyard shift, you develop a certain immunity to surprise. I figured I'd witness the full spectrum of human endurance, the countless ways a body can defy the odds. I've managed trauma cases, where people walked away from accidents that should have been unsurvivable. I've run codes where we shocked a heart back into rhythm long after we thought hope was lost. I've seen recoveries that made a mockery of every prognosis, but the sum of my education, the depth of my hands-on experience, and all the mandatory seminars on the latest medical advancements, none of it could have readied me for the events of October 20. It was a case that fundamentally altered my understanding of the line we draw between being alive and being gone. It's the reason I feel compelled to tell this story now. City Central is a bustling urban hospital, a level 1 trauma center that acts as a catch-all for a huge swath of the city. We handle everything from gang-related violence to multi-car pileups, from acute allergic reactions to the quiet tragedies of neglect. The night shift, from 7 p.m. to 7 p.m. is when the city seems to exhale its deepest troubles. Crises don't keep office hours, and after dark, we're on the front lines of it all. That Thursday, October 28th, began with a familiar rhythm. I punched in at 6:45 p.m., but got the rundown from the evening shift nurse, and started my rounds in our chaotic 15-bed ER. The board was a typical mix: a chef from a downtown restaurant with second-degree burns up his arm, a teenager with a concussion from a soccer game, an elderly woman with shortness of breath that proved to be a panic attack, and a frantic father whose son had ingested a handful of what he feared was medication, but was actually just candy beads. Dr. Evelyn Reed was our attending physician for the night. I've worked alongside her for a decade, and her diagnostic skills are second to none. Dr. Reed is calm, meticulous, and possesses an almost supernatural intuition for spotting the subtle clues other doctors might overlook. She operates on the principle that every medical event has a logical, scientific basis. For her, there are no true mysteries, only diagnoses waiting to be uncovered. Around 2:30 a.m., the relative calm of the early morning was broken by the rising wail of an approaching ambulance. A few minutes later, the automatic doors slid open and 2 paramedics guided a gurney toward us. On it lay an elderly woman who looked incredibly frail. The senior paramedic, Mark Rivera, a guy I'd known for years, met me by the trauma bay. "Found her down in her brownstone," he said, his tone professional but his eyes betraying a deep sense of pity. A postal worker noticed mail piling up and called for a check. "We found no ID, no phone, no next of kin listed anywhere." My gaze fell on the woman on the gurney. She looked to be in her early 80s, with fine white hair that, while now in disarray, was cut in a classic, elegant style. She was dressed in a simple, dark blue wool coat, the kind of timeless garment that suggested a life of quiet dignity. Her skin had the waxy, grayish tint that I'd come to associate with the body's final surrender. "Give me the rundown," I asked Mark as we shifted her onto the bed in Bay 5. "Her numbers are in the basement," he said, glancing at his tablet. "Heart rate is faint and erratic. BP is barely palpable at 70/30. Breathing is shallow, agonal. We managed to get a line in, but she's been completely non-responsive. No signs of injury, no paraphernalia. Looks like she's just been fading away, and we found her at the very end of the process." I started my own assessment as Mark and his partner packed up their gear. The woman's pulse was so faint I could barely find it in her carotid artery. Her respirations were the classic Shine-Stokes pattern I'd seen in so many dying patients. I peeled back her eyelids. Her pupils were fixed and dilated. "Ma'am, can you hear my voice?" I asked loudly, leaning close to her ear. Nothing. Not a flicker of an eyelid. I performed a sternal rub, a painful stimulus meant to elicit a response from even a deeply comatose patient. Still nothing. She was as close to death as a person could be while still having a heartbeat. Dr. Reed appeared at the bedside, just as I was hooking up the cardiac monitor. "What's the story, Sarah?" I gave her the summary. "Elderly Jane Doe, found unresponsive at home. Vitals are profoundly unstable, consistent with an end-of-life state." Mark mentioned the piled-up mail, so she could have been down for a day or 2. Dr. Reed nodded, her focus entirely on the patient, as she conducted her own examination. She checked for an airway obstruction, listened for breath sounds, and ran her hands over the woman's body, searching for any sign of what had brought her to this point. Her conclusions were the same as mine. This was an elderly woman whose systems were failing. "Let's get a full panel of labs," Dr. Reed ordered. "Metabolic, CBC, troponins, tox screen, and get a portable chest X-ray. We're flying blind here." While I drew the blood samples, I noticed something that felt both poignant and important. Tucked inside her coat was a simple silver locket, tarnished with age, but clearly a cherished item. It was a small sign that she was a person with a history, with attachments. Her hands, though wrinkled, were clean, her nails shaped and cared for. She wasn't neglected, I remarked to Dr. Reed, an hour later, as the first lab results started to populate on the screen. Someone cared for her, or she was meticulous about her own care, until very recently. "I was thinking the same," Dr. Reed said, studying the X-ray on the monitor. "And her labs aren't what I'd expect. No glaring signs of sepsis, no indication of a major cardiac event, no toxins. It's as if her body just ran out of energy." We followed our standard procedure for unidentified patients. Our hospital's social work team was paged to begin the search for her identity. The police ran her description against their missing persons database. We were trying to piece together a life while simultaneously watching it end. All the while, I kept a close watch on her. Her condition was unchanged, critical but in a strange way stable. Her heart rate remained dangerously low and irregular. Her blood pressure refused to climb out of the basement, and she never once responded to my voice or touch. At 3:15 a.m., I made an entry in her chart that I assumed would be one of my last. "Patient remains unresponsive," I typed. "Vitals unchanged, indicative of terminal decline. No family located. Comfort measures in place." Our hospital has a compassionate care protocol for these situations. For elderly patients with no known contacts who are clearly in their final moments, we cease aggressive measures and focus on providing a peaceful, dignified death. It's one of the most emotionally taxing parts of the job, but also one of the most meaningful. No one deserves to die alone and forgotten. The ER was having one of those nights where it felt like the entire city was falling apart, which meant I was juggling 4 other patients in various states of distress. I made a point to check on the woman in Bay 5 every 15 minutes, adjusting her blanket, moistening her lips with a swab, and just being a quiet presence in the room. Every time, I found her in the same state, unconscious, with vitals that were barely sustaining life. At 4:00 a.m., I was explaining discharge instructions to the father of the candy-eating boy when I heard a soft, clear voice from behind me. "Pardon me, dear." I turned, expecting to see a lost family member. Instead, I saw the elderly woman from Bay 5. She was standing fully upright in the doorway of the room. But this couldn't be the same person. The woman before me was poised and alert. She had straightened her wool coat, and it now hung perfectly on her frame. Her white hair was neatly arranged, and her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and looking directly into mine. "I feel so much better," she said, her voice steady and warm. "I'm terribly sorry for the bother, but might I trouble you for a cup of tea?" I just stood there, my mind refusing to connect the dots. This was a physiological impossibility. The woman I had been monitoring was minutes, not hours, from death. People in that state do not simply get up and ask for tea. "Ma'am," I finally managed to say, my own voice sounding distant and shaky. "You need to be in bed. You were extremely unwell." She offered a small, knowing smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "Oh, I know I was in a bit of a state, but it seems to have passed. I am dreadfully thirsty though. I don't believe I've had anything since yesterday." My first thought was that I'd made a terrible mistake, that this was a different patient I'd somehow mixed up. I rushed back to Bay 5. The bed was empty. The cardiac monitor, which had been tracing her faint, erratic rhythm, now showed a flat green line, the leads dangling where a patient should have been. "Evelyn," I called out, my voice louder than I intended. Dr. Reed was there in an instant. Her face went through the same stages as mine. Confusion, disbelief, and then intense, professional curiosity. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Reed," she said, approaching the woman with the calm, gentle demeanor we reserve for potentially confused patients. Do you know your name? Of course, the woman replied, her tone suggesting the question was a bit silly. It's Eleanor Vance, and I must commend you. This is a very well-run department. Everyone has been remarkably gentle. Dr. Reed and I locked eyes. It was the first time we had a name for her, but far more pressing was the fact that Eleanor Vance was standing here. The picture of health, after being at death's door less than an hour ago. Eleanor, I need to check you over, Dr. Reed said. Would you mind having a seat on the bed for me? Not at all, doctor. Eleanor moved to the examination table and sat down without any help or sign of weakness. Her movements were fluid and graceful, not those of someone who had been comatose for hours. I wrapped a blood pressure cuff around her arm and clipped the pulse oximeter to her finger as Dr. Reed began her exam. The numbers that flashed on the screen were so normal, I had to double-check the connections. Blood pressure, 30/75, a perfectly reasonable reading for her age. Heart rate, a steady 68 beats per minute. Oxygen saturation 99% on room air. These were not the vitals of a dying person. They were the vitals of a healthy octogenarian. Eleanor, Dr. Reed began as she finished her physical assessment. Can you tell me what you remember about coming here tonight? Eleanor paused, her brow furrowed in thought. I remember feeling dreadfully weak yesterday. I believe I must have fainted. The next thing I recall is waking up here a short while ago. But I feel perfectly fine now, truly. Dr. Reed's exam was meticulous, and her findings were all negative. Eleanor's heart was in a regular rhythm, her lungs were clear, her neurological exam was flawless. She showed absolutely no residual signs of the critical condition she had been in. Would you still like that cup of tea? I asked, my brain still trying to catch up with reality, but falling back on her simple, polite request. Oh, that would be lovely, Eleanor said. A spot of Earl Grey, if you have it. I don't mean to be a nuisance. I went to the staff lounge in a daze. I found a box of Earl Grey tea bags and heated water in the electric kettle. I found some crackers and a small piece of cheese left over from someone's lunch. I arranged it all on a tray, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind replayed the night's events. When I got back, Eleanor was seated in a chair, conversing with Dr. Reed about the challenges of urban healthcare. She spoke with an eloquence and insight that was startling, making several astute observations about patient care and hospital administration. I placed the tray on a rolling table beside her. She thanked me profusely and began to sip her tea, her movements delicate and practiced. As she ate, she continued to chat, asking me about my children and remarking on the dedication it must take to work such hours. No, she said, pausing with a cracker halfway to her lips. The hardest part of the job isn't the medicine, it's managing the fear. A good nurse learns to treat the fear just as much as the illness. It was a comment of profound understanding, the kind of wisdom that comes from deep experience. She spoke like someone who had spent a great deal of time inside hospital walls, not just as a patient, but as an observer of the human condition. Dr. Reed and I continued to exchange baffled looks. We'd both seen incredible turnarounds, but this was different. This wasn't a recovery, it was a resurrection. People do not go from agonal breathing to discussing healthcare policy in under an hour. It defies medical science. Eleanor, Dr. Reed said carefully, we'd like to keep you for observation for a few more hours, just to be safe. Is that acceptable? Perfectly, doctor. I'm in your hands. I wouldn't want to be any trouble. As Eleanor finished her small meal, I found myself just watching her. There was no doubt this was the same woman. She had the same fine features, the same elegant bone structure, and the same small crescent-shaped scar above her right eyebrow that I'd noted on my initial intake. But the person inhabiting that body was completely transformed. The woman from earlier was a shell, unresponsive and fading. This Eleanor was vibrant, witty, and fully present. Her skin had a healthy, rosy glow. Her breathing was even and deep, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence. At 5:30 a.m., Dr. Reed pulled me into the hallway. Sarah, I've been a doctor for nearly 20 years, she said, her voice low. I have absolutely no framework for what just happened. I'm right there with you, I admitted. My notes from 2 hours ago describe a woman in the active process of dying. Her vitals, her unresponsiveness. Everything pointed to an imminent, irreversible decline. And now she's in there asking if we need help tidying up. Because she feels guilty for taking up a bed. I want to run everything again. Dr. Reed decided. Labs, EKG, a head CT, if she's willing. There has to be an explanation, and if there isn't, I need to document that we looked for one and found nothing. Eleanor was agreeable to all of it. Her new blood work was pristine, better than that of most people 20 years younger. Her EKG was perfectly regular. The CT scan of her brain showed no evidence of a stroke, hemorrhage, or any other acute event that could explain her earlier state. As we were going over these bafflingly normal results around 6:00 a.m., I saw Eleanor stifle a yawn. "I believe I'd like to rest my eyes now," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with a gentle weariness. "I feel quite tired all of a sudden. I'm sure you have other people who need this space. Please, rest as long as you like," I told her. "There's no rush at all." Eleanor gave me another warm smile. "You've all been so very good to me. I do hope I haven't been too much of a puzzle." I helped her lie back on the gurney, fluffed her pillow, and drew a warm blanket over her. She closed her eyes with a sigh of deep contentment, like someone settling down for a well-earned sleep. "Will you be all right with the noise out here?" I asked, nodding toward the main ER, where the morning rush was beginning to build. "Oh yes," she murmured, her voice already distant. "I can sleep through anything. Thank you again, my dear, for your kindness." Within moments, her breathing became slow and even. She looked utterly peaceful. I dimmed the overhead light and pulled the curtain around her bed to give her some privacy. At 6:45 a.m., as I was preparing my handover report for the day shift, I decided to check on Eleanor one last time. I parted the curtain quietly, not wanting to disturb her. The moment I saw her, I knew. She was in the exact same position I had left her, but the life was gone from her face. The healthy color had been replaced by that familiar, unmistakable pallor of death. I reached for her wrist. There was no pulse. I placed my hand on her chest. There was no movement. I called for Dr. Reed. She was at my side in seconds and confirmed what my senses had already told me. Eleanor Vance was dead. Not dying, not unresponsive, dead. And from the feel of her skin, which was already cool, and the early signs of lividity on her back, she had been for some time. Her pupils were fixed, and the first hints of rigor were setting in around her jaw. Reed and I stood in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the busy ER fading into the background. Less than 2 hours ago, this woman had been alive and well, talking, eating, and passing every medical test we threw at her. Now she was gone, with no struggle, no alarm, no medical event to mark the transition. "What time did you last see her?" Dr. Reed asked quietly. "Around 6, I said. She told me she was tired. She seemed to just drift off to sleep. And you haven't checked on her since?" I retraced my steps of the last hour. "No, I didn't want to wake her. It's been about 45 minutes. Dr. Reed began the somber task of officially pronouncing her dead, noting the time and the clinical findings. But as we went through the motions, we both knew the official explanation was a fiction. The death certificate would list cardiac arrest as the cause, a term that was technically true but explained nothing. Eleanor had died in her sleep, a peaceful end that many hope for, but the journey she took to get there was unlike anything either of us had ever encountered. In the days that followed, I couldn't get Eleanor Vance out of my head. I reread her chart a dozen times, searching for a clue, a missed detail, anything that could provide a rational explanation for her temporary return to life and health. I talked it over with senior colleagues, with specialists in neurology and cardiology. I scoured medical journals for case studies of spontaneous, short-term reversals of end-of-life states. No one could offer a theory that fit the facts. A patient in Eleanor's initial condition does not simply recover. A body that is actively shutting down does not reboot itself, function perfectly, and then shut down again hours later. It violates the fundamental principles of physiology. But it happened. I saw it. Dr. Reed saw it. And her medical chart is a permanent, inexplicable record of it. A week later, our social worker finally had a breakthrough. She had located a grandniece in Oregon. The niece explained that Eleanor had been a career nurse, having worked for over 45 years in cardiac care units in several major East Coast hospitals. After retiring, she had lived a quiet, solitary life. The niece told us that Eleanor's health had been slowly failing for the past few years, but she was fiercely independent and had refused all offers of help. She was a nurse to her core, the grandniece said over the phone. She always said she knew her own body better than anyone, and that when her time came, she didn't want to be a burden. That final piece of information cast the entire night in a new light. Eleanor had been one of us. She would have known exactly what was happening to her body as it began to fail. She would have recognized the signs of dying, and she would have known with absolute certainty that her recovery was impossible. I have to wonder if that's why she was so calm, so accepting. When she woke up, she wasn't shocked or disoriented. She simply accepted the gift of a few more hours of clarity and used them. Eleanor Vance was pronounced dead at 6:45 a.m. on October 29, but I've come to believe she died twice that night. The first time was a slow fade that began in her quiet brownstone. The second was a peaceful departure in our emergency room, after she had shared a final moment of connection with people who understood her life. I've worked in this ER for 18 years. My practice is built on science, on data, on evidence. But Eleanor's case showed me that there are things that happen in the space between one breath and the next, that science can't measure and our textbooks can't explain. I still work the night shift at City Central. I still bring the same clinical focus to every patient I treat, but now, I pay more attention to the moments that defy easy explanation. The sudden rallies, the peaceful passings, the small, quiet events that suggest healing is a force far more complex than we understand. Eleanor Vance's case is filed away in our records as an anomaly, but for me, it's a constant reminder that our job is not just about procedures and protocols. Sometimes the most profound thing we can do is to simply be a witness, to be present for people as they navigate the most critical moments of their existence, even when those moments defy all logic. I think Eleanor knew her time was up. I think that recovery was her way of giving herself one last shift. She spent her final conscious hours in her natural habitat, an emergency room, talking with her colleagues, validating our work, and reminding us of the meaning behind the chaos. And then, when she had said what she needed to say, she clocked out. In 18 years of emergency nursing, it was the only case that taught me that the line between life and death isn't a line at all. It's a door. And sometimes, for reasons we will never understand, a person is allowed to step back through it for a moment, just to say a proper goodbye. If that isn't a miracle, it's the most profoundly human thing I've ever seen. I will carry the memory of her with me always.